My talk is based on a paper that I wrote 7 or 8 years ago, and which was based on a conference that I was invited to speak on. And the conference was generally on the title of Religion and Violence. Given that this is a talk about religion and violence, particularly violence in the name of Islam, terrorism in the name of Islam, I will also examine some of the sacred texts and look at what kind of messages do those sacred texts have about violence, and what can we learn, and what are the implications of that for our world today. So we'll start with the overall definition of terrorism. What are the odds? In other words, how much of a threat terrorism really is? Let's look at that part also. What are the costs that we have incurred in fighting terrorism? And then we'll go into terrorism in the name of Islam with an analysis of the sacred texts, look at the roots of terrorism, and finally conclude with how do we combat this menace. We have to recognize that sometimes the way we convey our own understanding of a problem, we have to ask the question, is it helping us or is it hurting us? Because to many people, particularly across the Muslim world and also in the US, many American Muslims will complain that the word terrorism is exclusively used for the Muslim community. Professor Bruce Hoffman is arguably one of the foremost experts of terrorism in this country. And this is how he described the problem that we face whenever we talk about terrorism. And that sufficiently captures my sentiment about this, that terrorism is a pejorative term. It is a label that one has to use very carefully. Hence the decision to call someone or label an organization terrorist becomes almost unavoidably subjective, depending largely on whether one sympathizes or opposes the person, group, or the cause being described. So here is the odds of dying. How likely you are to die from a heart disease? 1 in 7. From cancer, little bit less. Lung disease, little bit less. Firearm assault, 1 in 340. And where is terrorism? Way up there, 1 in 20 million. We are more likely to die from a lightning strike than from a terrorist act. Now, these are the odds that were calculated by the National Safety Council. So these are people who do this as a profession, looking at the odds of dangerous things happening and what are the likelihood. In other words, the inordinate amount of attention that we give to terrorism, particularly in the name of Islam, and the inordinate amount of money that we have spent on the war on terror does not match with the reality of what the actual threat is. Now, this is the global effect of terrorism. Where do terrorist incidents happen? And this is as of 2014. So as current the data as I can pull out. This is from a database called the Global Terrorism Database. It's produced by the University of Maryland. They do a great public service. The data is available for free. You can play around with the data, and much of my research actually relied on that data set. And they track global incidents of terrorism, and they've been tracking that since the 1970s. Look at the concentration over here. Bulk of the terrorist actions are concentrated here, which is the Pakistan-Afghanistan border, that region. Second region, Iraq, Syria, Central Africa, parts of Northern Africa, somewhere here in the Caucasus, a little bit over here in Indonesia, Malaysia, but the rest of the world, our homeland, not as much. Other parts of the world like China, Japan, Korea, not as much. So terrorism is a problem, but when you put it in perspective, it is more of a regional problem than a global problem. The primary victims of terrorism, and since we are talking in this lecture about terrorism in the name of Islam, the primary victims of that type of terrorism are Muslims. Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Taliban, they kill far more Muslims than people of other faiths. Not that one is better or worse than the other, just to give you a perspective on this whole phenomenon. Let's look at the cost. After 9/11, we declared the war on terror, often called the global war on terror. And we have continued that war until this day. And what's the end result of that? By estimates, and this is produced by Brown University's Watson Institute for International Studies, they have a website called Costs of War. You can follow that website. They do a great job in tracking these numbers. 370,000 people have died as a direct result of this war. Well over 200,000 civilians have been killed. 6,800 US soldiers have died in this war. 6.7 million people have been rendered refugees as a result of this war. And the cost of this war is, by some estimates, about $4.4 trillion. By US congressional estimate, about $1.6 trillion. So the range of number, in some sense, this also presents a problem that we still don't have a correct accounting of how much we are spending, although the money is being spent on our tax money, right? So somewhere between 1.6 and 4.4, and that's quite a range. And this will give you, year by year, how we are spending this. Two things stand out in this picture over here. First, since 9/11 till today, 90 to 95% of the spending is on war efforts, security efforts. Very little spending is on foreign assistance. The US aid part of it, the diplomacy part of it, is a minuscule part of the overall spending that we engage in the war on terror. Of course, it peaked in 2008. Since then, because partly as a result of our withdrawal from Iraq, it has gone down, the spending effort has gone down. But nonetheless, the numbers, the $1.7 trillion that we are spending, you can see we have spent since 9/11. You can see a year by year where we are. Now let's look at the origins of terrorism. Terrorism did not start after 9/11, or did not start on 9/11. This would be news to many people. Terrorism is as old as human history. The oldest record of terrorism would be what we call the Zealots. These were Jews living under oppressive Roman rule. And one of the ways in they tried to get rid of the oppression is by murdering Roman officials through murder and assassination. The word assassins in the 11th to 13th century actually is derived from the word hashashin, which was the way hashish, which is a narcotic, cannabis. This was the preferred way by which one of the Shia sects used to assassinate Sunni Muslims. So they would intoxicate themselves through cannabis, and then it will ease for them the kind of murders that they would commit. And the word assassins is actually derived from the Arabic word hashashin, which is the user of cannabis. When we think about the word terrorism, this is like a very brief snapshot going from the Roman era, 1st century to 11th century to our modern century. So of course I'm skipping a lot of historical periods in between. The modern day word of terrorism is the 18th century France and the reign of terror from the French Revolution. And so going back to the START database, I looked at data from 1970 to 2014. So that's 44 years of data. In that 44 years of data, it has captured over 140,000 cases of terrorism committed by 2,400 groups. Here is a listing, not an exhaustive listing, just a representative listing of some of the groups that have been listed on that database. As you look through that list, what stands out? It defies any definition. There are religious groups and non-religious groups. There are national groups and pan-national groups. There are communist groups, left-wing groups, and right-wing groups. Islam, Christianity, Judaism, you name it, Hinduism, everybody. So to look at Islam exclusively as a Muslim phenomena, as often has been presented in our popular and even in our policy discourse, is really misreading the problem. And in the end, it creates more hurdle towards solving it, as I will mention. I'll come back to this towards the very end. Terrorism has many motives and many factors. It's a complex phenomena. And trying to boil it down to religion or any other single factor is doing a great disservice to this discourse. Now let's get to terrorism in the name of Islam. Why do we have this phenomena? Why do we have this phenomena called terrorism in the name of Islam? That some people like to use Islamic terrorism, and some people insist that that's the only way to describe this phenomena. I have disagreements on that, but we'll cover that later. There's a reason why this connection is made. And in my view, the main reason for this connection is the actions of the terrorists themselves, because they claim that their actions are in the name of Islam. So 9/11 was certainly the high point or the low point, whichever way you want to look at it, of this phenomena. And this is one example. This is Osama bin Laden's quote from 1996, several years before 9/11, 5 years before 9/11. The point of this quote, I shared this in my paper also, is to show that groups like Al-Qaeda, well before 9/11, for a very long period of time, had been trying very hard to make an emotional and a political connection of their actions to Islam. And how do they do it? One of the ways in which they try to do this, look at this quote and underline the points which may or may not resonate in this audience, but I know will generally resonate in a Muslim audience. Why? I'll show it to you. People of Islam suffered from aggression, inequity, and injustice. He's tapping into something that is a reality for a large number of Muslims, particularly those in the Middle East. Not all Muslims, but certainly a large number of Muslims, because the majority of Muslims don't live in the Middle East. They live in South Asia and Southeast Asia. But for a large number of Muslims, it is a reality because they have lived under aggression, inequity, and injustice, sometimes by their own people, sometimes by foreign powers. That is the core of the political grievance. But how does he connect that political grievance to religion? He connects that to the US forces stationed in Saudi Arabia during the first Gulf War. He makes an emotion. There's no legal connection, by the way. There's no theological connection over here. But it's an emotional connection that foreign forces are stationed in the land where we have our holy sites. You can understand the emotional pitch over here. Then he connects. This is the crucial religious pitch that he's making. That belief, which in Islam, the Arabic word is iman. Any Muslim would know what that word means. It is a word that is beyond belief. It is belief, but it is more than belief. It's a core part of the Islamic ideology. That he says that clearly belief necessitates that it is important that Muslims push out the American army from the Holy Land. This would be construed as a jihad. It would be construed as a jihad if Osama bin Laden was a legitimate religious authority and a political authority making that claim. He was a civil engineer making that claim. But, who is counting, right? So this is the language that created a fervor among some Muslim youth, and it also catalyzed the perception that there's a link between Islam and this violence. Their actions, their words, forced that connection. They wanted to make that connection. And we gladly walked into their trap. Oh people, we created you from a male and a female, and we made you into races. The we over here is God. That's the royal pronoun. We made you into nations and tribes so that you may know each other. Unequivocally, the Quran states that our diversity in language, diversity in ethnicity, diversity in cultures, diversity in religion, whichever way you define diversity, is God-given. It is part of God's creative wisdom. But there's a purpose behind this diversity. The idea behind this diversity was so that we compete with each other to do good, so that we know each other, not we become divisive. We don't use differences to divide, we use differences to engage in a world that is much more interesting. Now, Islamic jurisprudence, also the Quran, sourcing from the Quran, does talk about the sanctity of life. And do not kill a person which God has made sacred, except by justice or law, except through a due process. So generally, killing of civilians, completely out. Islam does not rule out capital punishment. It allows for capital punishment, but only under a due process, not the indiscriminate killing that we see the terrorist groups engaging in. And it goes on to say that what is the equivalence of killing an innocent person? The Quran says if one killed a person, unless it be for a due process, again under a due process, it would be as if he killed all of the people. Now, all of the people that is referred over here is all of humanity, from the first person created to the last person that would live on this earth. That's the equivalent sin of killing one person. So the idea of 72 virgins that is waiting for somebody in heaven is certainly not found in the Quran. Terrorism is murder, pure and simple. And murder is unequivocally forbidden in the Quran. In chapter 6, verse 151, the Quran says, "And do not kill a soul that God has made sacrosanct, save lawfully." Again, except through a due process. Capital punishment, murder is forbidden, death penalty is allowed in Islam, but again, it has to be through a due process. Not only that, not only is murder prohibited, period, any form of action, any form of violent action that imposes Islam is certainly not permissible. Certainly not permissible because you couldn't come up with a clearer statement than chapter 2, verse 256. There is no compulsion in religion. Other things, fight in the way of God against those who fight against you, but do not begin hostilities, pointing out that war is permissible, but only as a defensive posture, not as an aggressive posture. Moreover, only a duly constituted leader can declare war, not a civil engineer, and certainly not a bunch of people driving around in the back of a pickup truck. And even in war, even if a legitimate war has been declared by a legitimate authority, there are rules of engagement, not unlike what we consider the just rules of war or what would be considered today as the Geneva Convention of fighting wars. And 1400 years ago, the rulers and leaders of Islam, based on their understanding of the Quran, articulated that the first caliph in Islam, that was the ruler, the political leader who succeeded Prophet Muhammad in 632 of the Common Era, he laid down what are called the golden rules of combat. Among them, do not kill women and children, the old or the infirm, do not cut down fruit-bearing trees, do not destroy any town, do not poison water supply, and so on and so forth. An early version of what we would consider as the modern-day Geneva Convention that govern our methods by which we engage in war. Spreading terror, mischief, and strife is forbidden. I want to quote this scholar over here. This is 1070 of the Common Era, about 400 years, 4 centuries after Prophet Muhammad. A Muslim jurist wrote, and I quote over here, "Anyone who disturbs free passage in the streets and renders them unsafe to travel, striving to spread corruption in the land by taking money, killing people, or violating what God has made it unlawful to violate, is guilty of hiraba." The Arabic word for terrorism is hiraba, is guilty of hiraba. Unequivocally, all of the actions that groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Taliban engage in is terrorism. Without any shadow of doubt, it is terrorism. But the question is it Islamic terrorism? We've still not fully answered that question. Let's continue. Even if Muslims have legitimate grievances, which many Muslims do, but legitimate grievance does not require illegitimate ways of voicing them. In Islam, the process is as important as the outcome. The ends justify the means is certainly not part of the Islamic theological concepts. As Prophet Muhammad is reported to have said, "Accustom yourselves to do good if people do good, and not do wrong, even if they do evil. Even if somebody is acting unjustly towards you, that does not give me the right to be equally unjust towards them. There has to be a proper, legitimate way of voicing grievances and solving grievances. And terrorism is certainly not a legitimate method. The word jihad, which many of the terrorist groups claim that they're engaged in jihad, is certainly not holy war. It does not translate as holy war. The Arabic word for holy war would be al-harb al-muqaddas. Al-harb, war, al-muqaddas, holy, the holy war. That phrase does not appear in any Islamic sacred text. Nowhere has Islamic sacred text ever considered even a righteous war or a just war as holy war. So there could be a legitimate reason to fight back. If my country is being invaded, if my fellow citizens are being attacked, I have a legitimate reason to pick up arms and defend my family and my country. But even then, it is not described as holy, maybe necessary, but not holy. Jihad literally means to struggle, to strive. And there are three levels at which this striving can be engaged in. At a verbal level, by speaking truth to power. At a personal level, where we each struggle every day to do the right thing. And it can also be physical, where we have to use our physical force to stop oppression or stand up for justice. So there are three levels. It is not exclusively physical. It can be internal. So the word jihad is used in many contexts in the Quran. As I mentioned, there are rules of war in Islam: self-defense, proportionality of force, rescuing oppressed people. But perhaps the most important is 861, chapter 8, verse 61, where the Quran says that even when war is made permissible to you, if the enemy inclines towards peace, make peace. And I often say that in the life of Prophet Muhammad, whenever he had a chance, he chose an imperfect peace over a righteous war. And that to me is the enduring lesson of how to live and coexist with other people. What do I show over here? One of the most common questions I get. Where are the Muslim voices condemning terrorism? Don't take my word. Take out your smartphone and Google the phrase, Muslims condemn terrorism. 3 words. And this is what you will come up with. This is the first screenshot of the first 2 pages. And over here, if you can read this, it says, this is page 2 of 245,000 Google pages. Muslims condemning terrorism. We have to recognize that terrorism is not an ideology. It's a tactic. In my view, the phrase war on terror does not make any sense to me. It's like, how do you declare war on a tactic? You can declare war on a state, on a country, even an ideology. But how do you declare a war on a tactic? As I mentioned before, terrorism is a result of state monopoly of violence. Wars cannot defeat terrorism, as they cannot answer what happens the day after. That was the lesson we learned in Iraq. We could depose Saddam in no time, but we didn't know what to do with the country. And that will always be a challenge if we think that we can depose dictators here and there and solve somebody else's problems. We can certainly be a force of reason and a voice of reason and moderate many things, but to think that we can just walk into a country, depose a dictator, and they will welcome us as liberators just does not jive with what the real experience is. We should stop sensationalizing terrorism. What terrorists want is for us to be afraid. Why does ISIS behead people on video camera, in front of a video camera, and propagate those videos around the world? They know every time somebody clicks on it, and they're afraid, they're achieving their objective. They don't need to send armies to divide us. A simple video, YouTube, is very effective in dividing us. Terrorism breeds on fear. Terrorism requires a thoughtful response, not a sensationalist response to it. Look at the non-stop coverage anytime it is perceived to be a terrorist action. But we are giving voice to the things that ISIS wants us to give. They want to claim they're doing it in the name of Islam, and we say we agree with you. They want to make us afraid, and we say, yeah, we are afraid, sure. So I often ask the question, 99% of the Muslims are peaceful and living their life in peace, and they're saying, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, they don't speak in the name of my faith. And 1% or less than 1% of people in ISIS or in Taliban or Al-Qaeda, they're saying, no, we are speaking in the name of our faith. So the question is, why do we disregard the voice of the 99% who are living peacefully with shared values with you and me, and accept the viewpoint of the 1% or less than 1%, is probably less than 0.009% of the Muslim world that is engaged in this type of violence, whose values do not agree with anything that we stand for? So why do we accept their interpretation and disregard the interpretation of 99.9999% of Muslims? So at the end of the day, solving the problems of ISIS or anything has to deal with our addressing the root causes, a conversation that we are very reluctant to have. As I say, if we are a hammer, then every problem looks like a nail. So terrorism, we have the hammer we have the greatest fighting force in the world. We have the greatest security establishment in the world. So we think that's the only way we can solve the problem. What about engaging in other types of diplomacy? What about giving people an alternative in the region? It is difficult to do under the circumstances, but these efforts have to start before violence erupts, not when violence has already ravaged the country. So we have to figure out a mechanism of addressing those grievances. And addressing those grievances does not mean we are siding with the terrorists. Because the grievance, as I mentioned to you, Osama bin Laden's 1996 statement, he was tapping into a grievance that resonates with a vast majority of people living in that region. One of the reasons that religion has suddenly become this factor in the region, if you think about Middle East and North Africa in the 60s and 70s, it was a pretty secular culture across the Middle East. But religion became a voice because every other order failed. The Ottoman order failed. The post-colonial state structure failed. Secularism failed. Nationalism failed. So after repeated failures of government, it's the breakdown of the nation state and the power vacuum that the breakdown brings is the fundamental cause of this violence. So my big conclusion, terrorism is going to be with us. It's how we react to it that will determine the fate of our democracy. Terrorists do not pose an existential threat to our country or our democracy. They cannot derail our democracy, but we can. On how we treat minority groups, how we reach across and talk to other world powers, how we engage in the world, how we preserve our values as we try to combat this menace. All of those things will dictate where we end up in our democracy. But terrorists cannot derail us. It's up to us to stand up and fight this thing in the proper way. I do not claim to know that I have this magic ball in front of me and I know exactly how the world events will unfurl. But I can certainly, looking at history, conclude that things that we have tried in general have not worked for us. We have spent close to $4 trillion on a war effort, and we are still, and in every succeeding decade, the problem seems to be getting worse than the previous decade. And it is not a partisan problem. It is, if we constantly look at this through the partisan lens, through the divisive lens of Democrats and Republicans, progressives and conservatives, Muslims and non-Muslims, then we are doomed to fail. But if you look at this as our common problem, it's a common human problem that we are faced with, then I do think there is a path to success over here. Thank you so much.